By the end of March 1945, Japan's army in central Burma was no longer retreating in order, it was being cut apart. Mandalay had fallen, Meiktila had fallen, supply roads were severed, formations were arriving too late, and Japanese counterattacks were smashing themselves against a force that should never have been able to stay there. The strange part was that General William Slim had not hidden his offensive. He had shown the Japanese exactly what they expected to see. Real crossings, real artillery, real pressure, all pointing toward Mandalay. Then, while their attention fixed on the obvious prize, IV Corps crossed the Irrawaddy farther south near Nyaungu. Tanks and infantry burst from a fragile bridgehead and raced roughly 80 miles toward Meiktila. If that crossing failed, the entire deception would collapse. If the Japanese reacted one day sooner, the armored column could be trapped against the river, but they did not. Slim did not build fake bridges. He built real ones in the enemy's mind. In December 1944, General William Slim's 14th Army was advancing toward the battlefield everyone expected. To the west lay the Chindwin River. Beyond it stretched the dry Shwebo Plain, a wide country of dusty roads, villages, scrub, and open ground where British and Indian armor could move. Farther southeast stood Mandalay, the former royal capital, beside the Irrawaddy. Roads, railways, prestige, and geography all seemed to point toward the same objective. Operation Capital had been built around that logic. Slim commanded 2 corps,
up to 4th Corps and 33 Corps,
together controlling 6 infantry divisions and 2 armored brigades. His supply line already ran hundreds of miles back toward India. Aircraft carried food, fuel, ammunition, and medical stores forward. But even air power could not erase distance. The army needed a decisive battle before the monsoon turned roads into mud and made every extra mile more expensive. Slim expected General Heitaro Kimura to defend the approaches to Mandalay. The Shwebo Plain appeared to offer the Japanese their best chance. They could force the 14th Army to deploy, attack prepared positions, and pay for every village before reaching the Irrawaddy. That was the battle Slim had prepared to win. From Kimura's side, refusing it made sense. Japanese formations had already been mauled during the disasters at Imphal and Kohima. Standing in open country beneath Allied aircraft would expose troops, guns, and transport before they could force a close fight. The Irrawaddy offered something the plain could not, a barrier that compressed an advancing army toward a limited number of crossing sites. Kimura did not have to stop every British and Indian soldier. He only had to identify the main bridgehead, concentrate against it, and crush it before armor could cross. But as patrols moved forward, they found something more dangerous than a fortified line. They found absence. Japanese rearguards delayed the advance, then disappeared. Villages that should have anchored defensive positions were abandoned. Reports reached headquarters showing that the main Japanese formations were not gathering on the plain. Kimura was pulling them back behind the Irrawaddy. The Japanese retreat was not proof that Kimura had lost control. It was the move that broke Slim's first plan. Now picture the map inside 14th Army headquarters. The Chindwin lay behind the advancing troops. The Shwebo Plain opened ahead. The Irrawaddy curved across the front like a broad barrier, with Mandalay on the far side. Slim's corps had crossed one major river, moved through difficult country, and built an offensive around a battle the enemy had chosen not to fight. If Slim continued directly toward Mandalay, he would attack exactly where Kimura now expected him. Assault boats would have to cross under fire. Tanks, guns, fuel bowsers, and bridging equipment would crowd the western bank. One failed bridgehead could leave thousands of men exposed with a broad river behind them. Worse, time was running. 14th Army did not merely need to capture a city. It needed to destroy the Japanese forces in central Burma before they could withdraw south, rebuild another defensive line, and force the campaign into the monsoon. Slim stood over a map whose boldest arrow had become obsolete. He could keep pushing toward the obvious prize and accept the battlefield Kimura had prepared, or he could separate the city from the system that kept it alive. The answer began with a movement the Japanese were not meant to see. While XX-3 Corps continued toward the Shwebo Plain and Mandalay, the main body of IV Corps would turn away, move south, through the Gangal Valley, and search for a crossing near Pakoku. Mandalay would remain visible. The decisive force would disappear. On the 14th of January 1945, men of the 19th Indian Division began crossing the Irrawaddy at Tarbakian, north of Mandalay. The river was narrower there than it was farther south, but the crossing was still opposed. Infantry moved in small boats toward the eastern bank, while guns fired over their heads. The next day, another foothold was opened at Cloak, roughly 20 miles downstream. Japanese troops counterattacked for weeks, trying to crush the bridgeheads before they could grow. Those battles were not distractions staged with empty trucks and painted guns. Men were being killed for ground. Slim wanted the Japanese to watch. Operation Cloak worked because it did not ask General Kimura to believe something absurd. It arranged real events into the wrong conclusion. The operational map now contained two very different movements. In the north, Lieutenant General Montagu Stopford's XXX-3 Corps would keep the northern battle real, violent, and impossible to ignore. It pressed toward Mandalay through the Shwebo Plain. The 19th Indian Division held its bridgeheads above the city. Farther west, the 20th Indian Division prepared to cross near Nyaungu. Guns, vehicles, supply dumps, radio sets, and engineer stores all supported a visible advance toward the most obvious prize in central Burma. Far to the southwest, beyond the main focus of Japanese attention, IV Corps was moving through the Gangaur Valley toward Pakoku. The distance between these efforts mattered. Slim was not trying to conceal a patrol. He was shifting the striking mass of a corps across difficult country while leaving enough signs in the north to suggest that both corps still belonged to the same battle. Radio traffic helped preserve that picture. So did the continued presence of formations near Mandalay. Most important, the X-33 Corps did not pretend to attack. It attacked. Now picture the map from General Kimura's headquarters. To the north, reports described bridgeheads at Tarbakian and Cloak. Japanese counterattacks were meeting Indian infantry already established across the river. Mandalay lay behind those crossings. Every mile the bridgeheads expanded appeared to confirm the same threat. Then, on the night of February 12, the 20th Indian Division began crossing near Nyaungu, about 20 miles west of Mandalay. Its assault boats were worn. Some leaked. Men crossed in darkness, carrying rifles, ammunition boxes, wireless sets, and the equipment needed to turn a strip of riverbank into a defended position. The first footholds were small enough to be erased by one concentrated counterattack. Japanese troops attacked them night after night for nearly 2 weeks. If the Nyaungu bridgehead collapsed, XXX-3 Corps would lose men and equipment at the water's edge. It would also weaken the entire picture Slim needed Kimura to believe. But the bridgehead held. From Japanese headquarters, the evidence was not false. Multiple Allied divisions really were crossing north and west of Mandalay. Real artillery supported them. Real tanks waited to follow. Real soldiers were dying to keep those crossings open. That was the brilliance of Cloak. The deception was not a fake attack. It was a real attack given the wrong meaning. Kimura's reasoning, therefore, carried its own trap. Mandalay was politically important, operationally valuable, and visibly threatened. Reinforcing it was not foolish. Failing to reinforce it could surrender central Burma's most famous city without a fight. But every unit drawn north became a unit that could not immediately strike south. Every report from Nyaungu consumed attention that was not being spent on Pakoku. Every hour used to measure the visible bridgeheads gave IV Corps another hour to approach the crossing that mattered. By mid-February, Kimura was watching an army force the Irrawaddy exactly where he expected the decisive battle to occur. At Nyaungu, far downstream, old assault boats were being dragged toward a different stretch of water. There, the deception would stop being an idea. It would have to survive machine gun fire. South of Pakoku, the Irrawaddy spread across more than a mile of open water. On the western bank stood the guns and vehicles of the 7th Indian Division. Across the river lay Nyaungu, with pagan and its ancient temples farther south. The eastern bank was low enough to land on, but exposed. Any boat approaching it could be watched from firing positions near the town. Behind the infantry waited the real cargo of Slim's plan, the motor vehicles of the 17th Indian Division and the Sherman tanks of 255th Indian Tank Brigade. None of them could move until a few companies of infantry survived the river. The crossing had already fallen behind schedule. Assault boats brought forward through the Gangaur Valley needed repairs, forcing a delay of roughly 24 hours. Engines had to work after hundreds of miles of movement. Hulls had to remain watertight. Oars, ropes, ammunition, and wireless sets had to reach the correct launching points in darkness. On the 14th of February 1945, the first waves went in. The main assault at Nyaungu included men of the 2nd Battalion, South Lancashire Regiment. A secondary crossing was attempted near Pagan. The river offered almost no protection. A stalled boat did not simply stop. It drifted in full view of the opposite bank. Then machine guns opened fire. Bullets struck the water around the assault craft. Some boats developed engine trouble. Others began leaking. Formation dissolved as crews fought current, mechanical failure, and gunfire at the same time. At Pagan, the crossing also fell into disorder. If the first companies were destroyed before reinforcements landed, the eastern bank would become a killing ground. The tanks behind them would remain useless on the wrong side of the river, and Slim's hidden thrust would be exposed before it had moved 1 mile toward Meiktila. This was the point where deception could do nothing more. A false interpretation might bring troops to the river. It could not carry them across it. The defenders around Nyaungu included units of the Indian National Army's 4th Guerrilla Regiment, fighting alongside the Japanese war effort. Their machine guns had the range fixed on the exposed water. The South Lancashires suffered heavily, but a small group reached the eastern bank and held a precarious foothold. From the west, tanks of 116th Regiment, Royal Armoured Corps, fired directly across the Irrawaddy. Artillery joined them, concentrating shells on the machine gun positions near Nyaungu. The firing had to suppress the defenders without striking the infantry clinging to the far bank. Under that cover, men of the 4/15th Punjab Regiment crossed to reinforce the survivors. The bridgehead did not appear suddenly. It accumulated boat by boat, ammunition box by ammunition box. Men dug into dry earth while engineers brought over wireless equipment and marked landing sites. Wounded soldiers had to move back through the same exposed water that carried fresh troops forward. By the following day, the defenders at Nyaungu were being compressed into tunnels and enclosed positions. Pagan was occupied soon afterward. What had looked during the first hours like a failed crossing was beginning to spread along the eastern bank. The location added another layer to the confusion. The Pagan Nyaungu sector lay near the boundary between 2 Japanese army commands. Reports could move upward through different headquarters before anyone assembled the full picture. The crossing looked local at precisely the moment it was becoming operational. What looked like a handful of infantry fighting for mud and sand was actually the doorway for a division-sized mechanized thrust. Starting around February 17, Sherman tanks of 255th Indian Tank Brigade were carried across on rafts. Each tank represented more than armor. It required fuel, ammunition, mechanics, recovery vehicles, and roads strong enough to carry its weight. One broken raft or one renewed artillery concentration could still choke the bridgehead, but the river traffic continued. The motorized brigades of the 17th Indian Division followed. Trucks crowded the western approaches, then emerged on the far bank facing east rather than north. They were not preparing to join the visible battle for Mandalay. They were preparing to leave it behind. Slim later described the Irrawaddy operation as the longest opposed river crossing attempted in any theatre of the war. Whether measured by frontage, complexity, or danger, its strategic meaning was now clear. The river had been Kimura's barrier. At Nyaungu, it became Slim's hidden door. By February 20, the Nyaungu bridgehead was no longer merely surviving. The next day, vehicles began moving through it. The road east from the Irrawaddy did not resemble an armored highway. It ran through dry scrub, loose sand, villages, and empty watercourses that could break an axle or swallow a truck wheel. Nyaungu lay roughly halfway to Meiktila. Beyond it stood Thebutcon airfield. Meiktila itself was about 82 miles from the river, deep enough behind the Japanese front that a large Allied force should not have been able to reach it without warning. Lieutenant General Frank Messervy now had to turn Slim's deception into movement before Japanese headquarters understood what had crossed the river. Major General David Cowan's 17th Indian Division had been reshaped for this kind of movement. The 48th and 63rd Indian Brigades were motorized. With them came most of 255th Indian Tank Brigade, Sherman tanks, lighter vehicles, self-propelled guns, engineers, ambulances, recovery crews, and columns of fuel bowsers. The force began leaving the bridgehead in 2 columns. Every mile increased its striking power and its vulnerability. Trucks threw dust into the air that could be seen for miles. Tanks consumed fuel faster than any infantry column. A broken vehicle could block a narrow track, and a demolished bridge could stop hundreds of machines behind it. If the Japanese identified the thrust before Cowan reached the open country beyond Nyaungu, they could cut the roads behind him and pin his armor far from the river. But Japanese headquarters was still assembling fragments. Reports from the south described vehicles moving east. According to a widely repeated account, an observer near Mount Popper reported roughly 2,000 vehicles moving toward Meiktila. The number appeared so improbable that a headquarters reportedly reduced it to 200. That small correction captured the entire deception. The Japanese did not fail to see the column. They failed to believe what they had seen. From their perspective, disbelief was reasonable. A force of that size had crossed a river only days earlier. Its road back to the Irrawaddy was narrow. Mandalay remained under obvious pressure in the north. The movement toward Meiktila could still look like a raid designed to disrupt communications before turning back. Cowan never intended to turn back. On February 24, the leading troops reached Nyaungu. Japanese resistance there delayed the advance, but tanks and motorized infantry forced their way through. Drivers had been eating dust for days. Crews refueled beside the road from drums and bowsers, while mechanics worked on tracks, engines, and damaged wheels. There was no time to build a comfortable supply system behind them. The column was not outrunning Japanese soldiers. It was outrunning Japanese understanding. 2 days later, the 63rd Indian Brigade swept wide of Meiktila and captured the airfield at Thebukon, roughly 15 miles from the city. The airstrip was more valuable than another stretch of road. Once secured, it could receive men, ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel without waiting for every truck to travel from Nyaungu. On February 27, aircraft began bringing in the 99th Indian Infantry Brigade. Dakotas descended onto the captured strip as troops secured the perimeter. Fuel for the tanks could be landed or dropped. Infantry that had not endured the entire road march could enter the battle almost beside its objective. What began as a vulnerable column now had a supply line in the sky. This was the first strategic reversal of the thrust. The deeper Cowan advanced, the more exposed his road became. But every mile closer to Thebukon also brought him closer to an airfield that could reduce his dependence on that road. Japanese commanders finally understood the scale of the danger on February 26. By then, Nyaungu had fallen, the airfield was being seized, and armored patrols were approaching Meiktila from directions the defenders had not prepared to face. The city now lay between two lakes, with roads, depots, railway facilities, headquarters, and airfields spread across a defensive area too large for its improvised garrison to seal quickly. Staff officers began collecting anti-aircraft troops, supply personnel, and elements of the 168th Regiment to hold it. They had days to build a fortress out of a communications center. Cowan had taken less than a week to drive from the river to Meiktila. Kimura had lost nearly all of that week deciding whether the drive was real. Meiktila was not a single fortress. It was a system spread around a lake. The city lay between roads, railway facilities, depots, headquarters, workshops, and several airfields. Meiktila Lake cut the urban ground into separate sectors. A defender could hold pagodas, warehouses, road junctions, and compounds, but could not easily move between them once tanks controlled the open streets. Roughly 3,000 to 4,000 Japanese troops were available when Cowan's attack began on March 1. The 48th Indian Brigade came from the north. The 63rd attacked from the west. Tanks of 255th Indian Tank Brigade swept around the city to sever communications and block reinforcement routes. Aircraft struck ahead of the infantry. Gurkhas, Punjabis, Jats, and other Indian Army units then moved into positions that had survived the bombing. Near the Kyaukpadawung Road, the 1st Battalion, 10th Gurkha Rifles, pushed south through increasing fire. By midday, one company had reached the shore of Meiktila Lake. Elsewhere, Japanese troops fought from bunkers, monasteries, supply buildings, and anti-aircraft positions whose guns had been lowered to fire at tanks. The layout turned the battle into a series of separate fights. One roadblock could hold up a brigade. One bunker invisible to a Sherman crew could stop the infantry behind it. Tanks had to move close enough to identify firing slits, while soldiers crossed open ground to point out targets. If the armor and infantry lost contact, the attack would dissolve into isolated assaults against prepared positions. But the Japanese garrison had an equally dangerous problem. Once Cowan's columns controlled the roads around the lake, each defended pocket became harder to reinforce. The installations that had made Meiktila a powerful supply center now divided its defenders into compartments. The thing that had sustained the Japanese army was becoming a cage for the men ordered to protect it. After roughly 4 days of fighting, organized resistance inside Meiktila was broken. Buildings burned around the lake. Wrecked vehicles blocked streets that had once carried supplies north toward Mandalay. The communications center had been turned into an Allied fortress. Then the road behind it disappeared. Japanese formations moved against the Nyaungu route and cut the overland connection to Cowan's division. More troops were ordered south from the Mandalay front. From Kimura's perspective, the opportunity was obvious. The British and Indian force had driven deep into Japanese territory, consumed fuel at extraordinary speed, and now stood separated from its river crossing. Under normal conditions, cutting that road should have ended the operation, but Slim had already replaced the road with the sky. Dakotas landed ammunition, fuel, food, reinforcements, and medical supplies. They lifted wounded men out. The defense was organized into 6 fortified boxes around the city and its airfields, because there were not enough troops to build one continuous perimeter. The most important was D-Box at Meiktila East Airfield. RAF regiment gunners dug slit trenches beside the runway and strung barbed wire across the approaches. At night, Japanese soldiers infiltrated onto the flat airstrip, hiding in ditches, scrub, and shell holes. Each morning, patrols had to leave their trenches and sweep the runway before transport aircraft could land. The airfield was not simply being defended. It had to be recaptured every morning. On March 15, Japanese 75mm and 105mm guns shelled D-Box hard enough to close the strip. Airstrikes eventually silenced the batteries, and flying resumed. During the night, Japanese infantry entered the airfield again. At 0600 the next morning, 2 RAF regiment flights moved onto the open runway. 2 Japanese companies opened fire from concealed positions. There was almost no cover. Flight Sergeant Norman Jerish was wounded but seized a Bren gun and fired while his men withdrew. When its ammunition was exhausted, he picked up another and continued. The fight lasted about 2 hours. 7 RAF regiment men were killed and 8 wounded. Japanese forces left roughly 150 dead and wounded behind when tanks and infantry finally cleared the strip. If the runway remained closed, aircraft could not bring in fuel or carry out casualties. Meiktila would stop being a trap for Japan and become a grave for Cowan's division. Instead, another Dakota came down. Kimura had succeeded in cutting the road. He had not cut the supply line. Every Japanese unit sent toward Meiktila now entered a battle sustained from the air, while the pressure on Mandalay continued from the north. The force that appeared isolated was becoming the anvil on which the Japanese counterattack would break. The Japanese had surrounded the city. They had not surrounded the sky. By the 3rd week of March, the Japanese attack on Meiktila had become a race against a second disaster. To the north, Mandalay was collapsing. XXXXI Corps had continued pressing across the Irrawaddy, while Kimura diverted attention and units toward Meiktila. Mandalay Hill fell. Fort Dufferin, with its thick walls and moat, was isolated and battered by artillery, airstrikes, and infantry assaults. On March 20, Allied forces declared Mandalay cleared. The city Kimura had expected Slim to attack had finally fallen, but it no longer mattered in the way he had expected. Mandalay had drawn Japanese strength north. Meiktila had pulled reserves south. Between them, the roads and railways that once connected the army became exposed corridors under Allied air attack. Units received orders to move, but fuel, transport, signals, and time no longer arrived together. Lieutenant General Masaki Honda was ordered to recover Meiktila, yet his headquarters reached the area without enough signal units to coordinate every formation converging on the city. Japanese battalions attacked with determination, but not as one instrument. Some struck airfields, others hit defensive boxes, others arrived after earlier assaults had failed. The strength of the Japanese soldier remained, The system that should have concentrated that strength was disappearing. On March 23, troops of the 20th Indian Division made contact with the 17th Indian Division north of Meiktila. The link was more than a meeting between two formations. It closed the operational gap Slim had opened weeks earlier. XXXX-3 Corps had come down from Mandalay. IV Corps had driven east from Nyaungu. The visible attack and the hidden attack had become one front. If Honda broke Meiktila before that junction hardened, Japanese forces might still reopen routes south. But every failed assault cost infantry, guns, and hours that could not be replaced. Allied aircraft watched the roads, tanks and mobile columns struck units trying to concentrate. Supply vehicles became targets before reaching the battlefield. The final large Japanese attacks came between March 27 and 29. They failed. There was no single moment when every Japanese formation became surrounded by an unbroken ring. The trap was operational, not geometric. Units could still move, small groups could still escape, but the army could no longer move as a coordinated system. Its northern position had lost Mandalay. Its supply center had lost Meiktila. Its counterattacks had lost synchronization. Its retreat had lost the roads, fuel, and communications needed to remain orderly. Slim had not trapped every Japanese soldier. He had trapped Japanese command inside a sequence of choices that arrived too late. The victory opened the road south. 14th Army could now drive toward Piabwe, Pegu, and Rangoon before the monsoon. The collapse in central Burma became a pursuit. The deception had not won Burma by itself. Indian infantry, Gurkhas, British units, tank crews, engineers, airmen, and transport pilots had paid for every stage in blood, fuel, and machinery. But deception decided where that strength would land. Somewhere in a Japanese headquarters, a campaign map still showed the thickest Allied arrows pointing toward Mandalay. They had not been imaginary. They had simply pointed to the battle Slim wanted Japan to understand. The decisive movement had begun farther south, with leaking boats, wet ropes, and Sherman tanks waiting on the wrong bank. Japan defended the bridges on its map. Slim crossed the one inside its assumptions. Subscribe for more hidden turning points where deception, terrain, and forgotten systems change the fate of war.